This is the third time this morning I've had to get a code texted to me. It's like, it's still me, y'all. Oh, all good. Yeah, and if y'all have cloth masks you like, or you have an N95, you can wear that repeatedly. So, just find something that's comfy for you and works for the 3 hours a week you gotta wear it with me. And again, thank you so much for doing that. For all the people who aren't fully vaccinated and all the people who can't be fully vaccinated, all that good stuff. Anything exciting on campus this past weekend? Oh, like nothing. Did anybody go down to the East Coast Surfing Championships?
I wanted to, but I work.
Oh, yeah, I didn't, but I'm kind of regretting it because I saw the pictures on socials and it looked like it was really fun, so. We've definitely gone in the past, and once you sort of temper your expectations.
I just don't understand why they hold it here.
Yeah, I have no
It's
idea.
literally 2 hours south of me.
Well, and like, I don't know if anyone has gone, but the waves seem like they're only like this. So once you temper your expectations, it's not gonna look like the surfing championships in like Hawaii, right? Then you can enjoy what they're doing. But the first time I went, I was like, what's happening? It is sort of rare that they're holding it here.
I mean, it makes sense because it is like centrally located on the coast.
That
but
is
also
true.
like literally 2.5 hours south of Denver.
Exactly, exactly.
I don't think people can care much about something happening.
Probably not, and I mean, depending on where on the outer range you go, it can only be like an hour and a half. You're going to like the Level Hills or something. Yeah, our exciting thing, this weekend was my daughter just deciding that being up at 2 a.m. is the way to be. She's not a baby. She just wakes up sometimes. It's like, I'm done sleeping. So, you know, that's always fun. We joke that she's had FOMO since she's about 5 weeks old. Like, that's the first time she was like, no, I don't want to sleep even though I'm tired. So, all right. This is the rest of our life. Good to know. Alrighty, so it's 9, so go ahead and start with roll. And again, hopefully by like next week, I'll have your names down. Might have to do it another week, so bear with me. And I'll just be able to check you off as you come in. Mia. Alrighty. Deja. Also tried to like associate name with place in classroom. If I had assigned you seats, you'd all be mad. But in general, I found that college students find a seat you like and you stick with it, which is cool. All right, Nora. All right, and Abby. Monica. Monica, any Monica? All righty. Sarah Ellis. Awesome. Miriam. Okay. Lauren. Micaiah. Lyric. Awesome. Onyx. India. Awesome. Jalen. I'm not getting her on my name now. Just check in. Daria. Ray. Heaven. Sydney. Alex. There you are. Okay, cool. Sarah. Melissa. And I got this mysteriously put under my door for you. So apparently this is a new thing they're doing is where the mail students. So there you go. All of you might get one throughout the semester. I don't know. Am I Hogwarts? Am I an owl? I don't know. All right, Linda. Antoinette. Jenna. Sequoia. And Grayson. Awesome. Thank you all again. I don't know what it is. I don't have, there's a disorder you can have, we cover in clinical neuropsych called prosopagnosia, where you like don't recognize faces. I'm not as bad as that, but it is like a little hard for me to associate faces with names, and I'm not sure why. All right, so today we are going to continue with our little history lesson in psychology. And then I am hoping, I think we'll get to an activity that we'll do about sort of who are we not hearing in psychology, who is not on these lists. And it should be pretty obvious. It is anyone who's not an old white dude, right? Pretty much. So women, people of color, people who are not cisgender, people who are not straight, or at least that we know of, right? Who's to say if any of these people were bi or gay? I don't know. Not judging either way. All right, so Wilhelm Wundt, or you'll hear Wundt, he was alive from 1832 to 1920. And he worked at the University of Leipzig in Germany. And he really was one of the driving forces that campaigned to make psychology an independent discipline. And so he was the person who established the first laboratory for the study of psychology. So when we talk about when did psychology become its own field, when did psychology become a science, we often use 1879 when he established that lab as our starting point, because that was the first time someone was fully dedicated to, I'm going to study this new thing called psychology. Even though, as we've seen, for centuries, right? And even if we look at like ancient times, millennia, people were dealing with the idea of mental illness and things along those lines. So he brought the scientific methods of physiology to bear on philosophical questions. So he was the first one that sort of took biology and philosophy and was like, I bet if we pair these, they'll make a good science. And so this is why psychology really straddles social science and natural science, depending on where you are within psychology. Some people argue it's more natural science, more social science. Some people argue psychology is a STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math field. Some people argue it's not. But this sort of bridge is one of the reasons why it works that way. So he wanted to study what he called the atoms of the mind. So he would do things like drop a ball, and he would measure the time from when it actually hit the floor to when participants pushed a button saying they heard it hit the floor or saw it hit the floor. So basically he was looking at reaction time, but he didn't really call it that at that point in time. So they asked them, press the key as soon as you hear the ball. And then he would ask other people, press the key as soon as you're aware that you heard the ball. And so what he found is you just ask them, press it when you hear the ball, they were faster than if you asked them to like wait until they were aware that they heard the sound. So he was really looking at sensation and perception. Sensation is when we take in information from the outside, and perception's when we're aware of it and we process it. And we're talking like fractions of a second, but it's still really interesting to look at. So this is when psychology was born. He was really interested in how does the mind work and how can we study it scientifically. All right, so then this happens in psychology a lot. When we get to personality, we'll talk about this more. Basically, as soon as something gets established in psychology, someone's going to argue against it. I mean, we just like have different ideas, and it's a healthy argument most of the time. Most of the time it's, you know, doing different research studies. Sometimes it gets really petty, like Freud and Jung, if at the end of their lives, just stop talking to each other. It's a little bit too dramatic in some cases, but the idea like, what should psychology be studying was the first real sort of battle or disagreement within psychology. And so there was structuralism versus functionalism. And so these were two intellectual schools of thought regarding the science of psychology. And so Edward Titchener was the person who really was focusing on structuralism. And the structuralists believed that psychology should be about analyzing consciousness into its basic elements. So if he was a chemist, he would be all about like, let's figure out the periodic table, basically. So, or physicists at this time were really trying to study how matter was made up of basic particles, atoms, and then what are atoms made up of, right? To do this, Titchener and his followers relied on a technique called introspection, which was a process by which a person makes careful, systematic self-observations of their own conscious experience. What would you imagine would be some of the problems with using introspection as a technique? Yeah.
The person might not have the ability to communicate wherever they're asking, young, and it might just not have.
Exactly. Yeah. This requires smart verbal people who understand what the heck you're talking about when you ask them to do it, right? What might be another problem? Yeah. Yeah, it's bias, right? And even if we don't mean it to be bias, humans just like aren't super good at remembering everything. And there are reasons for this. Like our brain purposely forgets stuff it thinks is unimportant. Yeah.
As well as the social and environmental bias.
Yeah. So social desirability bias, great. We actually, in some studies in psychology, will test for this to kind of rule it out. Sometimes people will just do or say what they think the researcher wants them to when they're doing a study. And it's not, again, like, it's just sort of like a human nature. We are pack animals, right? We're like wolves or horses, and we like to kind of get along with and support each other in general. There are exceptions, obviously. And so people tend to kind of like say what they think the person wants to hear. And sometimes even very intelligent people lack insight, right? Give you an example. I've been pretty open about this since my own experiences. So I, after the birth of my daughter, struggled with postpartum depression and anxiety. I have a PhD in clinical psychology, but it took me about a month to realize that's what was going on. Like, I remember crying and being like, I gotta watch myself for postpartum depression. It's like, even the most intelligent people who have all the information can sometimes lack insight in the moment because of everything else going on, right? All right. Then we had functionalism, and this is William James. William James is considered the founder of American psychology. And he wanted to investigate the function of consciousness. So instead of let's figure out atoms or the periodic table, it's like, let's figure out why. Why do we think? What do we do? Kind of goes back to like Descartes' ideas about thinking about thinking. So the functionalists thought the structuralists missed the point. James and his followers thought psychology should be about investigating the function or purpose of consciousness rather than its structure. So he led investigations of mental testing, looking into developmental patterns. He even started to study sex differences. And he was highly influenced by Darwin. He believed that our thinking was adaptive, that as humans, it allowed us to consider our past and then adjust our present circumstances and plan our future. This is great. This is beautiful and philosophical. What's the problem if you only focus on functionalism? What are you going to miss? If you're only focusing on the why, what important things might you miss? Yeah, the how, exactly. Like how people are actually doing what they're doing. So you really need both, let's be honest. And you'll hear me say this a lot in psychology, but you really need both in a lot of cases. You really need multiple perspectives. All right, so like I said, we'll talk about Freud a lot more when we talk about personality, but we got to bring him in because he really was the first person to do talk therapy. And that is a big component of what psychology is today, right? So he was actually an MD, he was a physician, and he was from Austria. As you can see, he was alive from 1856 to 1939. He actually, like, this is a quick side note, he has sort of a really interesting story in that he was Jewish. And so the end of his life, he actually had to flee from the Nazis and left Austria and lived in London. So if you go to his home in Austria, none of his stuff is there. It's all still in his London house. Really interesting. So he founded the psychoanalytic school of thought, and he really was the first person to think about, let's have people talk about their problems and see if that will help them rather than giving them medicine. Or at this time, there were a lot of really dramatic treatments they would give people, like putting them in cold or hot baths or, electroshock, things along those lines. And so his work with people with psychological problems led him to believe that people are influenced by what he called unconscious processes or unconscious forces. So one of the other words you'll hear is psychodynamic. And he really was trying to model after like thermodynamics. He thought there were these forces in the mind and that's what controlled us. The really interesting thing about Freud is that he tried to be scientific. He was just limited by what was available at his time. That being said, he wasn't very scientific. Yeah.
Well, I guess Sigmund Freud is kind of discredited because you can neither prove nor disprove his theories.
Exactly. Yeah. you know, and that is a big part of science. I teach theories of personality right after this. We were talking about this on Friday, just like part of psychology is like, if you have a theory or an idea, you need to be able to prove or disprove it. You need to be able to test it empirically. And you can't test a lot of his stuff because it's outside of conscious awareness, right? Another sort of sidebar, as I mentioned already, like Jung stopped talking to him. Jung was one of his disciples. Pretty much every single one of the people who worked with him ended up disagreeing with him on a bunch of his fundamental points, particularly, again, we'll talk about this more in the personality chapter, but Freud had a lot of interesting ideas about sort of the sexual nature of development. And pretty much everyone else who worked with him was like, no, that's not a thing. And so he never really found anybody who was really going to go along with him. So he said these unconscious forces control our thoughts, our memories, our desires. Those are all outside of conscious awareness. He believed that the unconscious conflict between these forces, as I just mentioned, particularly with regard to sexual urges, plays a central role in behavior. And this was scandalous at the time. So this was like Victorian Austria. And if you know anything about Victorian times, like I would be super scandalous in Victorian times. So I'm showing like a lot of ankle, right? Like people didn't show ankle. It's very sort of a repressed time. So the emphasis on sexuality was quite upsetting to many people. And then a big thing that was sort of throughout the French Revolution and philosophy at this time was thinking about free will. And if we have these unconscious forces controlling us, do we really have free will? And so a lot of people didn't like it because of that. The controversial nature of Freud's ideas caused great resistance in the field of psychology, and his ideas were not necessarily well received in academic circles. Despite, or maybe because of this notoriety and controversy, Freud's ideas moved to the mainstream, and I think they influenced thought more in modern ways in art and literature. So if you go to the English department and ask them about Freud, they're like, oh yeah, it's great, we use it all the time, right? And in psychology, like we respect what Freud did, but we also use a healthy amount of criticism. Exactly. I mean, Freud had his, yeah, so Freud had his own psychological issues. He struggled with depression, and he literally thought cocaine might be an antidepressant, so he tested it on himself.
Yeah.
It is an antidepressant, but for a very short amount of time, right? And he
also crazy on drugs.
Yeah, he also he actually died of throat cancer because of all the cigars. And it was, I don't know if you need this detail this early in the morning, but it was pretty gruesome. He ended up with like abscesses in his cheek and things like that as well. But he kept practicing till the end of his life. Oh, another fun side note about Freud, he was one of the first people to do pet therapy. He had a big fluffy dog and he would bring it in the therapy room and like made notes about how it seemed to ease his clients and calm them down. So that's kind of cool. So that's Freud. And I have to say, I'm one of the biggest Freud skeptics there are. That being said, when I went to London and went in the Freud Museum and like went in his office and saw the first couch where talk therapy was done, it felt like this oddly, not spiritual, but like, this is where it started experience for a clinical psychologist. So I don't know, there's some, we should respect him, but also again, acknowledge he had his own issues. All right, so what we often find in psychology is sometimes the pendulum will swing too far one way, and so people really come down against it. And behaviorism was a really good example of this. Behaviorism is in part a reaction to Freud's like, these unconscious forces are what do everything. And so behaviorism was all about, we are going to observe things and only look at things we can observe. So Watson was one of the founders of behaviorism, and he was from the US. And the basic tenet of behaviorism is that only observable behavior should be studied in scientific psychology. The argument was that's all we can objectively assess, so that's all we should look at. And so behavior was anything observable or an overt response or an activity. of the organism. And so behaviorism was not only people, but focused a lot on animal behavior as well. So Watson's ideas radically changed the landscape of psychology, and psychology now is often referred to the scientific study of behavior. And a lot of that came out of behaviorism. It was a radical reorientation of psychology as a science of observable behavior, and this idea of consciousness was abandoned. As you can imagine, just like we talked about with structuralism and functionalism, that's problematic, right? We're now missing what's going on in the mind if we're only looking at observable behavior. So John Watson was a big person who was in the nature nurture debate. So he said that it is because of nurture, it's because of how we are raised, our experiences in life. We're not born with all of our abilities. And so this is a quote he said: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed, and my own special world to bring them up, and I will guarantee to make anyone at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select. Doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, yes, even beggarman and thief." So his idea was nature, our genetics didn't matter at all. It was all how you were raised. Now, again, pendulum too far one way, right? We certainly, especially in modern science, recognize the influence of genetics and biological factors. So it's a mix, but for Watson, it was really nature. He did some really interesting studies related to this. So like, for example, some of his writings are about like the maternal instinct. And he observed mothers when they were first handed their babies, and he was like, there's no like maternal instinct. Every single mother is like, oh my gosh, what do I do with this baby at first? And then they figure it out, right? So he and the other behaviorists really emphasized the importance of the environment, the importance of what's around you, how you're raised, who the people in your life are. All right, Skinner was another big name in behaviorism. And so he said observable behavior only. He didn't deny that we have thoughts, that there are mental events, as he put it, just that they couldn't be studied scientifically and are therefore outside the realm of the science of psychology. In fact, he referred to anything that happened in the mind as a black box. He said, all that matters is what goes in and what comes out that we can observe. Again, pendulum way too far in one direction, right? We've certainly come back from this. So his fundamental principle is that organisms tend to repeat responses that lead to positive outcomes, but they also are less likely to engage in responses that lead to any kind of negative outcome or punishment. And so this is a basic principle of learning that we still use today. It's when we were talking the other day about, why a child might continue to have tantrums, is because we unintentionally gave them positive reinforcement for it, right? We gave them attention or what they wanted. So that all boils down to basic learning principles. Skinner trained animals using this principle with much success. And then his followers looked at it with humans as well. So he stirred up controversy in the early 70s when he published a book called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. And in this book, he said that all behavior is governed by external stimuli. People are controlled by their environments, not themselves. So again, here, imagine the 70s, right? If you think about what we know about the 60s and 70s and free love and civil rights. And then this book comes out that's like, you have no free will. Didn't go over so well, was controversial. But again, was an idea that was out there. So as behaviorism was going on, another reaction to psychoanalysis was also happening, and this was humanism. And so while behaviorism and psychoanalytic theory were dominating mainstream psychology, many people were having a really hard time with this lack of free will, believing they weren't masters of their own fate. And so there's this new school of thought called humanism, and it was led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers, also both American psychologists. And it focused on the unique qualities of humans, especially free will, and the potential for personal growth. Humanism is like a breath of fresh air when you read about it. It is very optimistic about people and our abilities. It assumes that everyone is just always striving to be the best they can be, but there are things that get in our way and hold us back. And so therapy would focus on helping us get around that. And so it focuses on personal growth, on freedom. And as you can imagine, now we're interested in mental processes again, not just observable behaviors. So they'll come back up when we talk about therapy. Rogers is one of the big names in therapy. So the really interesting thing is that prior to World War II, there were very few clinical psychologists. So you had Freud, but he was actually a physician, an MD. In this day and age, we would call him a psychiatrist. And then you had, a few other folks, but in general, we didn't have people studying psychology who also went and applied it. So if you think about the structuralists and the functionalists, they were all kind of in their labs studying things, right? They weren't out trying to immediately apply it and help people. So during and after World War II, and honestly, this started a little bit at the end of World War I, there was a huge need for psychologists to evaluate service people. And so one of the things psychologists got involved in was assessment. And so, for example, they developed the Army Alpha and the Army Beta, which was a test you would take to see if you could serve in the Army. The Beta was just not non-verbal, but it was for people who couldn't read, essentially. Illiterate, thank you, yes. And during World War II is when we really became aware of something we'd known about for years, but that just sort of used to be called shell shock, right? Or any other names. And today we call it PTSD, right? And so coming back from World War II, you had people who had experienced huge atrocities, and there was a recognition that we needed to help these people. So after the war, continuing treatment for veterans required more people who were applied clinical psychologists. And the VA, the Veterans Administration, funded many new training programs in clinical psychology in recognition of this. Until this day, the VA is one of the largest employers of psychologists because unfortunately, PTSD is still one of the biggest things that we deal with. The two signature injuries, quote unquote, of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan are PTSD and traumatic brain injuries. So psychologists are very involved in both of those. So as a result, in a few years after World War II, nearly half of all new PhDs in psychology were clinical psychologists. So we kind of went from no clinical psychologists to a whole bunch in recognition of these people need help. But then in the 60s and really in the 70s, we got a renewed interest in not only thought and what's going on in the mind in the abstract way that we heard about from the humanists, the Rogers folks, but also of how do we scientifically study what's going on in the mind. And this is the field of cognitive psychology or cognition. So these are the mental processes involved in acquiring knowledge, but also using that knowledge. So you're applying scientific methods to study those internal mental events, thoughts, learning, memory, attention, all that good stuff. So cognition involves thinking or conscious experience. So the dominance of behaviorist thought, pure behaviorism, significantly decreased with the advent of cognitive psychology. So some famous names in psychology really came into play here. Jean Piaget did a lot of work on cognition and development of kiddos. Noam Chomsky studied psychological underpinnings of language. Side note, Chomsky is one of many psychologists who's very controversial for the application of some of his ideas. Herbert Simon studied problem solving. And they all paved a new path in psychology by using these scientific methods for studying cognitive processes. At the same time, and really into today, there is a biological psychology that becomes very popular. And so James Olds, OLDS, is one of the big names here. He discovered that animals seem to experience emotion and that we can stimulate those by electrically stimulating different parts of the brain. And then in the 80s, Roger Sperry, like the shoe, SPERRY, demonstrated that there are different specialized functions within the brain, and they handle different parts of the brain handle different mental tasks. And so those two things have really combined now, and a lot of the research that's being done, at least from people who can get giant grants, because it is expensive, is using brain imagery, for example, to look at what happens when you engage in certain tasks. One of my favorites that I've seen a video of is they got actors and actresses and put them in a brain scanner and had them like recite monologues, looked at like which part of their minds were lighting up. Very, very cool stuff there. And obviously, we're always learning and growing. We're always figuring new things out. And a lot of these ideas are still around. There are still pure psychoanalysts who go ahead and study and treat people in that method. I actually have one who comes as a guest speaker when I teach my clinical psych class, just because I'm like, people should know that this still exists, right? Alrighty, so we're gonna pause in our lecture there for today. And I have an activity for you all. Actually, let me put this in slideshow. So if you have your phone, you can use it to scan this. If you have your laptop, if you go on our Blackboard page, there's now a section for assignments, and there's a link to this assignment there. And so what I'm going to do, just like syllabus day, is I am going to have you all kind of group up, and once everybody's got the code, I will go ahead and pull it up so you can see it. But basically, you're going to use a really cool website called Psychology's Feminist Voices. And for anyone who's like, ugh, feminism, feminism is just about the equality of all people, but also B, it's really about recognizing people who aren't in the mainstream. And you and your group will go ahead and pick a person from the website and answer some questions about them. We'll take about 10 minutes or so to do that, and then we'll have everybody report back so that we can learn about people besides the few people that are here. So I'll leave this up for one more second because I see a couple other people. And if you're in the back and need to come more forward, feel free. And as long as one person in your group has it pulled up, that should be fine too. Well, let me just show it to y'all real quick. So again, if you're on your laptop, and you go to in-class assignments, there's a link right here. Okay. And so each group has the same questions. You're going to go to this website, and there's lots of different things. So women past is where you want to look here. These are people from history, and you can just look by name. They also have some cool projects, like a whole section, if you click on projects, on women of color in psychology. That might be really interesting to look at. And so when you find someone, so let me, for example, go through the women of color one. Let's say I want to look at, the first Japanese woman to receive a PhD. Should be able to click. Well, okay. We'll do it from here. But you can search their name on the website, or you can, again, just go here, and it'll give you, here she is, and you'll see her biography, and it'll tell you things like what she studied, what she contributed. So she was the first Japanese woman to get a PhD in psychology. Very cool. Actually, she might have been the first Japanese woman to get any PhD, if I'm recalling correctly. So let me come around and kind of group you. It'll be pretty similar to the last time we did groups. And yeah, have you all choose someone and work through the sheet. So let's have you five be group one. The four of you in the back, be group two. All right. And then let's do. Yeah, you. Okay. Why don't we do, yeah, you 5, that might be, I'm trying to do it so you can actually talk to each other without like screaming. And then have the 4 of you in the back, be group 4, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 here in kind of an L, be group 5. So y'all are group 3, group 1, group 2, group 4, group 5. Okay, so as a group, talk through, choose a person, and then choose someone to enter the information about your person.
They are, they tell someone.